The print off the cuff.
Welcome to Off the Cuff after a break. And the reason we are back after a break is that we've got a lucky break that our friend and somebody we admire and read regularly and somebody who's read and admired regularly in India, Gideon Rachman, foreign affairs columnist from Financial Times, is in India, happened to be passing by for a family wedding, but we
Indeed.
waylaid him. Gideon, welcome to Off the Cuff.
Thank you very much.
You found time to come to India. We read your last column. Your plane came dodging missiles through Ukraine and
Well, I hope
and
not, but yeah.
over Iran.
Yeah.
An Air India plane. Air India still has some privileges.
Yeah.
It also says something about India's position in that part of the world. But for you to find time now, it's a family wedding. You must be missing the action with so many wars going on.
I'm delighted to be missing the action. It's quite wearing, actually, particularly if you sit in Europe. I mean, it's interesting being in India because here the war in Ukraine feels a very long way away and, almost like an abstraction, whereas it's quite a sort of, I wouldn't say it dominates the headlines anymore. It did for the first 6 months in Britain, and now it's kind of slipped away, which is a problem for Ukraine. But if you go to places like Germany, or certainly Poland, there is a palpable sense of threat. And we're also pretty close to the Middle East. We have deep concerns about what's going on there. And then, of course, there's the pressure of what Donald Trump might mean for Europe. So in a strange way, India feels a slightly more relaxed place. You're slightly further from although that kind of turbulence. But in terms of, I did actually have to say to my editor, by the way, I'm going to India for 10 days. She looked a bit not very happy. And I said, well, I can write from anywhere, because we were expecting and are still expecting at any point Israel to bomb Iran. And at that point, we'll have to all respond.
So what do you expect Israel to do? Because they cannot not do anything.
That's right. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that they will respond. So one of my better American sources has been right so far. I mean, I rang him. A lot of people thought they would go very quickly. And this guy said to me, no, they'll wait until after October the 7th, and then they'll probably wait until after Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement, which was a week ago. But they'll certainly do something before the American elections. So that leaves whatever it is, between now and November the 5th. The Americans are in a dilemma because I think they've been worried from the beginning of India They've been worried from the beginning that Israel would enlarge the war to the point where America gets dragged in, and obviously this is a moment of maximum danger. So I think that they think their best strategy is to work with the Israelis rather than just sort of shouting down the phone, on no account do this. They say, okay, we'll talk to them quite sort of intimately about what their options are. And by doing that, kind of try and talk them down. And for the moment, we think that Israel has been talked out of, or maybe it never really intended to do the most severe stuff, which is going after the Iranian nuclear program, and that they probably won't go after oil installations because the last thing anybody, certainly in the US or in the Biden administration, wants is a surge in the oil price. So they'll go after military installations. And then, the US has already moved in more anti-missile batteries into Israel.
So anyway, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, no.
When you said US is worried about being dragged in, they've been dragged in already.
Exactly.
Because they got some boots on the ground and they got these THAAD missiles.
Yeah, and in a weird way, they're more exposed than Israel in some ways because they've actually got troops all over the Middle East.
Right.
So they have outposts in Iraq, for example, or they've got a base in Qatar, and all of these things are vulnerable to attack. So and of course, the deaths of Americans resonates far more in the United States than deaths of anyone else. And so if you were to have the Harris campaign must be terrified that you have 20 dead Americans 2 weeks before the vote. Plays right into Trump's, narrative about they're weak, they've allowed us to be attacked. So they're very concerned about that.
Yeah. And how would the Iranians, they are making the same reading as we are, as you are. Iranians as well as Israelis. So what suits either of them in this situation, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the elections?
Look, I mean, I think that Iran, it's obviously less easy to read than Israel. The United States are a less open society. But if you just infer from their behavior, I think that they have been trying to sort of throw a few punches without getting into a full-scale war. Because this is a survivor regime. It's been there since 1979. It's fought off successively internal challenges. But the one thing that could really finish them off would be if they were in a war with the United States. At that point, you might be looking at regime change. So that's not in their interest. On the other hand, just to allow Israel to strike them without, and they obviously assassinated the leader of Hamas, Hania, in Tehran, which was a big humiliation. They've killed Nasrallah, who was very close to the Iranian leadership.
And his successor, and his successor.
Absolutely. And the first round of Iranian missiles fired at the Israelis back in April was after the Israelis struck some Iranians I think in their embassy in Damascus.
Right, in Damascus. Yes.
So as they see it, they've been provoked. The Israelis, of course, say, well, look, you've surrounded us with these militant groups. What do you expect? Each side has their narrative. But I think, just thinking about how states behave, the Iranians would feel that we can't allow Israel to keep whacking us and not do anything, because that's just an invitation for them to escalate. So they have to play this very difficult game. It's not a game, it's a pretty deadly form of warfare, of trying to display credibility and deterrence without escalating. That's a very difficult line to walk.
And Israel?
Look, Israel, I think, feels that it has... Israel's in a very radical mood, and they're feeling vindicated. Because for months, the Americans, in line with this policy of trying to prevent escalation, further escalation of the war, had been urging the Israelis not to open a second front with Hezbollah. The Israelis have said, now, well, we've done it, and we've been much more successful than you thought we'd be. We've killed the leadership of Hezbollah, and by the way, their rockets have not landed in Israel, although that's largely thanks to the Americans, or partly. So they're feeling like, well, we've taken this radical action and we've been vindicated. So I think the fear, or at least suspicion, in some Western capitals is that newly radicalized Netanyahu sees this as a big opportunity to really remake the Middle East. And he made noises early on about, toppling the Iranian regime in concert with the Iranian opposition inside. And I think the Israelis have sort of convinced themselves that the way to their security is external. It's not to do a peace deal with the Palestinians, which they don't want to do anyway. It's to get rid of Iran, which has sponsored all these terror groups. And therefore, if they can topple the Iranian regime, well, maybe the whole system is changed to their benefit. I think there are some in America, particularly on the right, who buy into that. But I think that, the American left, the Biden administration, are very wary of regime change in the Middle East, because they've tried that a few times and it tends not to work.
They are like surgeons who cut open patients, didn't know how to stitch them back on.
Yeah.
Syria, Libya, Egypt. We've seen so many of them.
Yeah. And I think,
Bangladesh now.
Yeah. One interesting thing is that I think Harris's national security advisor, a guy called Phil Gordon, actually wrote a whole book on America's failed interventions in the Middle East called The False Promise of Regime Change. So there are people there who understand the dangers of this, but it's always a very sort of, tempting solution just to believe, oh, well, we can knock these guys over and obviously it'll be better.
So you said you use the expression radicalized for Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Is it a radicalized messianic Netanyahu, or is he only radicalized to the extent that, oh, I can keep fighting and I'm not losing, I'm doing better, I've got nationalism, I've got Jewish paranoia of Iran, so I can carry on forever? Is it that cynical, or is it messianic?
Oh, I would say he's largely cynical, but he's got a lot of messianic people in his cabinet.
Ben Gvir and others.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, look, it's hard to read what's going on in the deepest recesses of his mind, but clearly he risked after October the 7th going down as a sort of disaster, as a leader who was in charge at the time of the biggest sort of civilian loss Israel suffered since the foundation of the state, massive security lapse. And, he's a guy in his mid-70s and has been around a long time, and like leaders of that sort, think about their place in history. And so I think he was very determined to turn that around and to stay in office and to lead Israel, as he would see it, to victory. He also has rather lower motives, which is that he, if there's a commission of inquiry, which has been promised for the end of the war, a lot of the blame might end up on his doorstep. Plus, if he leaves office, he's vulnerable to this corruption trial, which was going on and which is now proceeding very, very slowly. So, for all those reasons, he unfortunately has an incentive to keep the war going. And also, I think, I don't know whether you'd call it messianic, but he clearly does not believe in a two-state solution.
He
And
doesn't.
I think if he could annex the territory in some way or another, perhaps by driving the Palestinians out of Gaza, which is now pretty much leveled, he would take it.
Only Gaza or the West Bank as well?
I'm sure he'd like both, but the question is what's feasible. They may feel that with Trump in the White House, that will come back on as a possibility. But on the other hand, the break on them, I think, is Saudi Arabia, because that is a big prize, normalization with Saudi Arabia, and that if they were to formally annex the West Bank, I think that's over. And then
That's over, yes.
and then they're surrounded by hostile countries again.
Yeah, because then if Saudi Arabia does not respond accordingly, then they will lose support in the Islamic world.
Yeah.
And then they might have trouble on their street.
Well, they don't have support in the Islamic world. I mean, but they don't have support from the street.
Yes.
But they do have this opening with the elites, which was done through the Abraham Accords, and that would go anyway, because I think the elites would also begin to worry that it would just be untenable domestically, even though they're not democracies. They have to pay some attention to what people think to continue in a sort of normal fashion with Israel. So Israel would arguably be in the worst of all worlds, because it would have, I think, a domestic insurgency from the Palestinians. It would have a very divided Israel, and it would have enemies on all sides again. So not great.
So it's evident that Netanyahu would prefer Trump come November 5. Who would the Iranians prefer?
I think they'd prefer Biden-Harris, Harris now, because the Democrats were the people who did the Iranian nuclear deal, which they would like to see resurrected. I mean, it wasn't possible in the Biden administration, but I think the current regime, at least until this latest escalation, were sending signals that they wanted to normalize with the West. And their economy is in bad shape, and they're under military threat. Trump, is unpredictable and is surrounded by very right-wing people, and is very, very pro-Israel, so might buy into the whole regime change thing. I mean, I think the one break on Trump is he also takes Saudi Arabia very seriously. And, his first visit as president in 2016 was to Saudi.
Yeah. Now we shift to Europe. That's the older war. I mean, Middle East is the oldest war since the Second World War, but in the current times, more than 2 years old in Ukraine. Where is Russia positioned now? Because you write a lot about this. And I get a lot of knowledge from your writings. Is it really true to conclude that right now Russians believe that they are on the move and they are doing better, and just that their staying power has delivered for them?
That seems to be the case. I mean, I have to say I'm banned from Russia now, so I don't get first-hand information
You're a good
anymore.
guy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually do regret it. I kind of always enjoyed going to Russia, even though, and there you had interesting conversations there, not always comfortable conversations, but it was interesting. And as a journalist, you like to talk to everybody if you can. But yeah, look, I mean, I think that the Russians, or to put it this way, even some of the Ukraine's backers think they're losing slowly. But losing. Basically, Russia's a bigger country. It's got a population of what is roughly 150 million. Ukraine's population pre-war was about 37 million, and a lot of people have left the country. And so that weight of numbers and Russia's willingness to take enormous casualties, and Russia's ability to basically produce its own weaponry by turning itself into a military economy, means that they do have an advantage. Plus, sorry, I keep getting my countries mixed up. Plus, Ukraine has this constraint that to keep getting the Western weaponry, they've had to not strike into Russia, although they have had this Kursk incursion. But there's this current argument about whether they can do long-range strikes into Russia. Now, Russia's not under that constraint. It does long-range strikes into Ukraine all the time. So, yeah, I think the Ukrainians are at risk of running short of men, ammunition, and even morale. But has to be said, although things have been going Russia's way, they're making very slow progress. It's village by village. This could go on for a very, very long time, unless there's a sudden collapse in Ukraine, which is possible, but by no means something you could take for granted.
Possible, but not likely, you would say?
Well, look, I think wars are very unpredictable. So I don't think anybody could make a
I
firm
mean,
prediction, because if you
we
remember,
collapsed 46 all out this morning
yeah,
in
exactly,
Bangalore. So everything is unpredictable.
everything is that. But I was just thinking at the beginning.
Cricket and wars.
Yeah, particularly. But I was thinking at the beginning of the war, all the Americans and the British, who had good intelligence that Russia was about to invade, but when you said to them, well, what's going to happen? They all thought that Russia would be in Kiev within, a week or two.
Right.
And that wasn't what they wanted. That's just their reading of the military situation.
I wrote that in my column 2 days after the invasion started, saying that by the time you read this, Russians will probably be in Kiev.
Yeah.
And that was February 2020.
Yeah, well, I remember seeing Zelensky speak at the Munich Security Conference like 3 days before the invasion and saying to somebody, I wonder if this guy will be alive by the end of the next week. That's what it felt like. So that was incredibly unexpected. And then I think not quite as unexpected, but there was a feeling after the Ukrainians had forced the Russians back from Kiev and then taken Kherson and Kharkiv, that the wind was in their sails and that their counteroffensive could really, they could actually win this war. And that was more of a hope, but, a reasonably backed hope. And they got really nowhere. So those are two examples of people saying, well, we think we know where this is going, and then they don't. And, examples of the past. If you think of the end of the First World War, the German collapse was preceded by an offensive where it looked like Germany was going to win. They broke through the lines, they had a national holiday in Germany, and then they collapsed. So who knows? But at the way it looks right now, it doesn't look good for Ukraine.
Yeah. And how does the European-American equation work there vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, it depends who wins the US presidential election. But I think, oddly, there's not as much distance between Trump and the Democrats as one thinks, because I think both of them think there should be a peace conference next year, that Ukraine is not going to win, and that you should have a kind of freeze in place of the current fighting lines, that Russia will take what it's taken, that the West won't acknowledge that formally, in the same way as the West never actually formally acknowledged Russian, or even Russian sovereignty of the Baltic states in the Cold War. But it was just de facto part of the Soviet Union. But then I think the really big difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is not so much that, how to end the war, but what happens afterwards. I think the Democrats and the European Union certainly take the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine very seriously and would like Ukraine to be a viable state. So they think if they can freeze the lines more or less where they are now, Ukraine is left with a working port in Odessa, most of its agricultural land, most of its industry, then you can pour aid in, and then you've just got to somehow stop the situation that the Ukrainians are warning about, which is that Russia maybe pauses for 3 years, but rearms and then comes straight back at them. So that's where you get into security guarantees, and should we let them into NATO? And if we don't let them into NATO, is there some other form of credible security guarantee? And that's a real debate. I think Trump basically couldn't care less about that, would be my guess. He certainly wouldn't put American troops on the ground. And he's pretty ambivalent about NATO as it is. The idea that he would extend NATO to Ukraine, I think, forget about it. That's not going to happen. And that, I think, is why the Russians would like him, because I think he'd not only give them a possible victory, he'd also essentially forget about Ukraine. And so the Ukraine would be in the danger of being Afghanistan or Vietnam, where there's a peace declared, and then a couple of years later, it all collapses.
So now we know that Netanyahu wants Trump, Putin wants Trump, Iranians likely don't want Trump, and Zelensky definitely doesn't want Trump.
Yes, and India, what do you think the Indian government wants?
I think this government would definitely prefer Trump because they had a good equation. They also think Trump would lecture them less, and Trump administration would lecture them less.
Yeah.
Because this is a government of the Indian right, and there's a suspicion of the sort of the larger, it's not just Democratic Democratic Party, but also the foundations around the Democratic Party, uh, the media, the
Yeah.
liberal media, all of that packs into one neat conspiracy theory
Right.
that these guys are out to get us,
Right.
right? And this idea that this lot wants regime change everywhere. And now I don't think there's anybody in this Indian establishment who does not believe that what happened in Bangladesh wasn't an American inspired regime change.
Interesting.
Yeah, because there is no
I'll ask next time I go to Washington.
well, so
Uh,
I'm just this has nothing to do with whether I agree with this
Yeah,
or
yeah,
not.
yeah.
I'm just giving you my reading of the situation.
No, that's very
So I think
interesting.
there'll be big celebrations in the establishment if Trump wins.
But I think that certainly, I've only been here a few days, but they're certainly more discreet about it than, say, Netanyahu or Viktor Orban in Hungary, who are very openly in the Trump
Yes,
camp.
yes.
But that may also, I think, reflect the fact that, yeah, they'd prefer Trump, but actually they've recognized, I don't know if you agree, that there is quite a strong bipartisan
Yes,
commitment
and
to,
they've done very well with Biden administration.
Yeah.
This drone deal, which has just been signed, it was signed exactly on the day that Trudeau made his allegations on India, and exactly on the day that an Indian delegation, security agencies delegation led by one of our deputy national security advisors, was in Washington to exchange notes on this Nikhil Gupta Pannu issue. On that day, India signed this deal with General
I wonder
Atomics.
whether the Americans are deliberately sending these signals that we do want this relationship to survive, whatever happens in that case. Because similarly, Doval and Sullivan signed the U.S.-India tech deal in June,
Absolutely,
which
yes.
was when this case was already well underway. So yeah, but we'll see.
So it's not as if anything's been broken under Biden administration.
Yeah.
It's just that this is also a popular government of right nationalists. They like to be praised by foreign powers, and they like to be praised by foreign intellectuals, and they like to be hugged by foreign leaders.
Yeah.
Right. So in that
Sure.
situation, they think that might be more comfortable with Donald Trump.
To be fair, I don't think many countries like being lectured by anybody. Really.
Well, also anybody who lectures us should know that we can out lecture them anytime.
Right.
But India has been lecturing people since Nehru's era. But that said, I think on the establishment side, that will be the view. But nobody will be heartbroken
Yeah,
if
they can live. They can live with it.
Kamala
Yeah.
wins, because then in any case, this situation will continue. I would think that there will be people in the establishment who will worry just about Trump's lack of predictability.
Sure.
Right, on trade, on other issues. I called Modi and I called the Pakistanis so and so. He can call the Pakistani army chief directly. You guys make a deal on Kashmir. So, see, if he comes back, what kind of Trump are we going to get? His ego will be so inflated. What do you think?
And also, and who might he put in power? In fact, there's one of the names that certainly frightens the Democrats. I don't know if he's a figure that people in India discuss much, as Kash Patel, who is a very right wing, but I think basically anti-democratic.
I read about him.
Yeah, so I've never met the guy, but certainly when I was in the Defense Department, the Harris Defense, or not Harris Defense Department, Biden Defense Department, and there were sort of gaming worst case scenarios. It was that Kash Patel would come in as chief of staff, or maybe even as defense secretary or head of the CIA. Who knows? I mean, Trump will appoint people with no obvious
One more
qualifications.
Gujarati.
Yeah, but also Patel was noted for being totally on board with Trump's plans to purge the upper levels of the military and the intelligence agency. Really hates the intelligence agencies and believes them to be part of the deep state, etc. So if Trump were to try to do that, and he's talked a lot about it, those are the kinds of people that he would put in to do that kind of thing.
Are you worried about Trump's return, or are you enthused, unlikely, or are you indifferent?
No, I'm worried. I mean, I think, I have to try to sort of occasionally take a couple of steps back. And I think that there's no doubt, to me at least, that Trump is he's not an idiot. I mean, he may be losing it a bit. He's 78, and he rambles all over the place. But in some ways, he's a kind of political genius, and he's a very consequential president. Much more in some ways than Obama, in the sense that he broke with establishment orthodoxy and really changed American policy. I think for the worse, but he changed America fundamentally towards protectionism. He changed the whole rhetoric around migration, the whole build the wall thing has completely, made that the major issue in American politics. And he changed policy to China. He basically broke the integrate China into the global economy consensus that had been there since 1989. And all of that stuff the Democrats have kind of adopted, apart from the migration stuff a bit. But I think he's a danger to American democracy because of January the 6th. I find it hard to argue after seeing that he is a Democrat, with a small d. And I think he's a danger to Europe. I mean, sitting in Britain, I worry that Trump would make common cause with Putin and common cause with the far right in Europe, with the AfD, with Orban. And these were people who would undermine democracy in Europe. I mean, it's bad enough he undermines democracy in the United States. But, when it comes to my own country, both our security is very dependent on America. So who knows what he would do with NATO. But if he encouraged the kind of populist far right forces, they would get enormous encouragement from Trump being in the White House. So I think it'd be highly destabilizing.
Because right now he's already influencing the debate and the discourse in the US. Kamala Harris on so many things, issues is talking like Trump. She's like Diet Trump, Trump light.
I think she'd be very upset if she heard you say that.
Yes,
Shekhar,
on immigration. She's sort of
yeah, I think, look, it's classic politics that they can see, they read the polls, they can see that this is a good issue for Trump, and they have to try and shut it down because the most potent attack on her is that she's a sort of out of touch California liberal who's happy to leave the border open. I mean, it was interesting talking to her advisors when I was last there, which was just actually when Biden dropped out. And they were aware of this vulnerability on the border. And I said to one of them, do you think she should go down to the border and do like a public thing? And he said, no, that would be too sort of obvious. Now it's too late for that. She should have done it last year. But I noticed she's just done it actually. So they're obviously worried about that as an attack line. I mean, the trouble is that the only way you can stop all this, Trump didn't actually build the wall, which is why people are still coming across, is by policies of extreme brutality, really trampling on people's rights. And Trump is talking about doing that. He said he'll deport 11 million people. I mean, the mind slightly boggles at the attempt to do that. If you did that and you started deploying the National Guard and the military to raid people, to chuck them over the border, it'd be chaos. And I think you would have a movement inside the United States to protect these people. So you'd have civil unrest in America. But I was at the Republican convention, I went to a presentation by the head of the Heritage Foundation, who wrote this famous Project 2025. And he was talking about mass deportation. And in fact, at the Republican convention, there were people carrying banners saying mass deportation now. I mean, and I said, fine, you want to do this? But, we in Britain find that it's very, very hard, because you don't know where these people have come from. The countries they come from probably won't take them back, etc. And he said, I don't care. He said, we'll just round them up and chuck them over into the Mexican border and let Mexico handle it. It's a narco state, failed state, so whatever.
What is the best case scenario if you get a new improved Trump?
Trump works out, okay, so that the threats to democracy are mainly hot air, that the system constrains some of what he's doing, that he doesn't end up trying to arrest all his opponents. Similarly, that the mass deportation thing is a bit like the Muslim ban. It's something he talks about. Maybe he does a sort of attempt at it and then kind of forgets it. Because I do think that would cause turmoil in the United States if he were to try it. And that actually his advisors, as they did last time, talk him out of pulling out of NATO, and that actually he uses his strength and his unpredictability to get some stuff done. Because I think one of the problems with the Democrats in foreign affairs is they're too easy to read. We know these are people who don't want to get into future wars. and who are quite sort of process driven and quite risk averse. And that sort of takes some of the fear away from America when it's trying to intimidate the likes of Iran, etc., or even get its way with Israel or whatever. People kind of say, well, fine, we're going to ignore you. And that shouldn't be a position that a superpower's in. And so I'm not going to vote for Trump, and I'm scared, as I said. But that is something that, you could argue that Trump's kind of forcefulness, his unpredictability, very kind of crude but clear focus on national interest makes an America that is in some ways easier to read, but also an America that kind of gets its way more.
Yeah. So to that extent, what he's saying right now may turn out to be plain campaign rhetoric.
Yeah, or that, he loses focus or he's not able to do it. But sure, he likes to outrage. But, there will be people around him who try to put it into action. And if you think of some of them like Steve Bannon, they're going to be pretty angry. And Bannon's just coming out of prison now. He's not going to be in a very reconciliatory mood when he comes out.
So what, a curious thing, what's this brohood between Elon Musk and Trump? Because I think his one KRA seems to be to win over Pennsylvania for him.
Yeah. Well, that's as they say, the whole ball game. Harris can't win without Pennsylvania unless some other very unpredictable combination of states comes up. And I think if she loses, they may kick themselves for not picking Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania as her running mate. But look, Musk, it's very interesting. I mean, again, talking to some of the Democrats about it, they've been suspicious of Musk for a while. But I think, you're getting in the realms of psychology here. But if he seems to have been radicalized by the fact that one of his children, a boy, became a trans woman, and blames the sort of woke progressive movement for that. And that, I think, drove him towards the Republicans. And he's sort of anti-wokeism's become his big thing. And I think that, there may even be business reasons, because weirdly, I mean, if you think about it, what's Musk's big business? It's electric vehicles, which is something actually that progressives like, and that the Republicans are very pro the petrol economy.
Right.
So some people have theorized to me that maybe Musk is actually trying to protect his business, because Trump, in his very kind of weirdly outspoken way, said, well, I can't be against electric vehicles now because Elon's behind me. So maybe there's a business reason behind it. But I think my guess is it's ideological, that Musk is a kind of brilliant engineer and a brilliant businessman, but he's slightly, to me, all over the place politically. He has a kind of weird array of political views, but they've just driven him towards the Republicans.
Yeah, he's bought a toy for himself called it X.
Yeah.
And now he holds forth on it like he was a global leader.
And he tweaks the algorithm so that everybody gets to read his views every day.
I get to read them all the time. So now, let me bring you back to India, because I know you have to run. First of all, where do you see India's stakes in both the Ukraine-Russia situation and in the Middle East? And then how do you read what's going on, another war that's going on between India and Canada mostly?
Well, I mean, I, along with Western policymakers who are far more important than I am, have tried and failed to persuade Indians that actually, it's not in their interest for Russia to win in Ukraine. My argument would be that if you have a successful annexation by an authoritarian power, that, the old rules-based order that everyone laughs at, and it is a bit hypocritical, but it means something. And I think if Russia would Russia succeeds, China would look at that and say, great, America's been unable to stop that. They certainly won't be able to stop us in Taiwan. Then people in India will say, well, Taiwan's a long way away, it's whatever, it's not our problem. So yeah, I actually think that a sort of Russia-China axis that is intent on overturning the current world order, which is basically, I think, what they're doing, in the end isn't in India's interest, because it is, closer to the Western world. It's a rising power that needs an open economy, not a fractured economy. And it has a real threat from China. So for all those reasons, I would say I think would have been in India's interest. But I do understand the Indian arguments. I've heard them, and you know them better than me. It's not our fight. We don't want. Russia's been good to us in the past. We need a strong Russia to balance China. We need low oil prices because we've got a lot of poor people. All of those arguments are valid arguments. So fine. That's where India is. On the Middle East, again, it's interesting, just sort of on an observational level, that India, certainly during the G20, positioned itself as a leader of the global South. But on the Middle East, it's totally out of step with the other global South countries I go to. I've been in, the last 18 months to India, Indonesia, and Brazil, both of which are totally up in arms about Israel and what it's doing. India much less so.
As is South Africa.
As is South Africa. So those are, the kind of G20 countries from the global South. Yeah, South Africa's leading the charge, as you say. Actually, I was there as well in July. And India's out of step with that. But I think not necessarily to its cost, but it does tell you that the global South is not really a coherent thing, I don't think. I mean, except that it's a bunch of countries that feel the West's too powerful, but then where that leads you, I'm not quite sure.
Well, it never worked with non-aligned movement, right? This is non-aligned movement 2.0.
Right.
Except non-aligned movement was generally aligned around the deputy superpower then, that's the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Today, if this one is more inclined towards China, how does India relate to this? So I think a lot of the Indian talk about the global South is just hot air talk.
Okay.
Why cede this to China?
Yeah.
Anybody would like to be the leader of one large part of the world, but I think that's also an exaggerated expectation for this global South to accept the leadership of India.
Yeah. And India, Canada, I must say I'm rather fascinated by it, partly because it kind of blew up while I was here, this
You're to blame.
Yeah, exactly. I came here and immediately the Canadians were expelled and the Indians were expelled. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because I think, and it also has this American element because there's a similar attempted assassination plot, allegedly, that the Americans are looking into. Look, it's something that it's an interesting example of countries getting trapped by a situation that none of them want. I don't think India wanted this embarrassment. I don't think America really wants a good relationship with India, but there's this thing going on. And then Canada. I mean, I know that Trudeau's not a popular guy here, but I actually don't think it's difficult for Canada to have a big country with 100 times their population, whatever it is, gunning for them, perhaps literally. But once these things get rolling, and I think this is something that maybe India, I don't know how much the government has taken on board. They're difficult to stop because when you have judicial processes and court cases, it's a hard thing to say, okay, well, look, this is bad news for everybody. Let's just put it to one side. So I'd be very interested to see, I mean, if the Canadians have the evidence they claim to have. If they don't, then India's in great shape and Trudeau is humiliated. I mean, may lose power anyway for domestic Canadian reasons. But I think something I heard here was, when Trudeau goes, it's kind of over. I'm not sure if there's a case going and it has to be brought to court and the evidence has to come out, that could be a bit awkward. And similarly with the US thing, clearly the Indians and the Americans are now jointly trying to diffuse it. And maybe if Trump came in, he'd just somehow find a way of just shoveling it all to one side. I don't have enough of an understanding of the American judicial process, but my sense is once there's sort of depositions made and cases sort of proceeding, they're kind of hard things to stop. So I think it could be something we live with and that as journalists will follow with fascination for a year or so.
Well, I think if Trudeau goes in Canada, the case will go on, but chances are that the government will not politicize it. Because that government's vote bank will not be.
If the other guys,
but the case will go on.
Yeah, but they just won't be holding massive press conferences.
Yeah, as in America, the case will go on, but they are not politicizing it or naming and shaming India. We are working with India, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the Indian. I mean, I think the interesting thing will be the Indians be able to hold the line that this was a kind of rogue operation. Some guy will kind of give you and you can arrest him, or whether this trail that the Canadians have implied leads all the way up to the top, whether the evidence of that comes out. Because I think, yeah, in a way, the face-saving solution for everybody is to say rogue operation. Here, have this man, put him in prison. We can all move on. Whether they can stop that, I don't know. But I mean, obviously, for the Americans, I think there's some analogy with the Khashoggi thing, where the Americans briefly said, we're not going to have anything to do with Saudi Arabia, and then they had to walk it back because they need the Saudis. And they haven't made that mistake with India this time. They know that they need India for all sorts of reasons. So they've tried not to heat it up.
Also, importantly, in this case, nobody got killed.
Yeah, although on the other hand, it was going to happen in America, whereas
Yeah.
Khashoggi was killed in Istanbul.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't there on their soil. So therefore, their justice, their kind of federal bureaus were not involved. But so, yeah, it's tricky. But I think that there's a will on both sides to try and calm it down.
Lessons for India in conclusion?
Yeah, probably don't do that kind of thing.
But the answer would be, but all the other countries have been doing it.
Yeah, but they haven't actually, because it's true that America has its drone strike program, but they don't like drone strike people in Britain or even in India.
In a friendly country.
Yeah, exactly. Or in a country, I think they would say in a country where there's a rule of law,
Right.
so that you can't say, the argument for doing it to bin Laden in Pakistan is that you can't ring up the Pakistanis and say, look, Mr. bin Laden's at number 25, can you go and arrest him?
I think
That's
more
not gonna
likely
happen.
it happened the other way around.
Yeah.
It's somebody from Pakistan called up and said, Mr. bin Laden is number 25.
Whatever, but in a way it's a sign of respect for another country's democracy and its legal system and its friendliness that you say, okay, we're not going to do this here. And even the Israelis, who are ruthless as hell, have not actually killed anyone in Europe or the United States since I think the late 70s. There was an assassination in Paris. They've done people in Dubai, Baghdad, etc., but not in Europe.
So I think that's a good point, Gideon. I wish we could talk for hours, but you have stuff to do. Congratulations, you had a family wedding just
I did,
now.
yeah. I got exposed to the full Indian wedding experience. It was
Full
great.
Telugu wedding
Yeah, yeah.
experience,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I know what Telugu
Yeah, it was great.
food is like,
Yeah.
and what a Telugu wedding is like. Every Indian wedding, Punjabis get a bad name. Every Indian wedding is an Indian wedding. You can call it Punjabi wedding, Telugu wedding. So keep coming back to India
With pleasure.
and write more about India.
I'd like to.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shekhar.